What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church Sermon Spotlight, where we are coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend to debrief in an effort to send biblical truth. And what better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm one of your hosts, Abby Linaburg, and our co-host today, first time ever.
Which is hard to believe.
I know,
Let's be real.
It really is. Cole McQuaid.
First and last. Just
Thank
kidding.
you. Whoa. We don't need any of that predisposition here.
Cole, I'm so glad you're here, buddy.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I've listened to Sermon Spotlight a couple of times, and I always take copious notes during every single sermon. So it was about time that someone asked me to be on this thing. So I'm ready to grill Caleb with his sermon.
Great. Perfect. I'm glad you're here. And you heard him already. Caleb Pearson preaching in the pulpit.
Yes. Thanks for having me. Good job with the intro. You really owned it. I felt it. It's good.
Good. I'm glad.
Cole, I'll come your way first. Normally what we do here is you give us a little weekend in review. So just like from your perspective, how was the weekend? What are some things you noticed? What was going on?
So when Caleb started preaching and I saw that his passage was only a couple of verses, I was actually a little bit nervous for him because I thought, oh my goodness, how is he going to go for 45 minutes with this and have it be detailed and applicable for our lives? Because it seemed very narrative heavy. We're just talking about the disciples coming down the mountain with Jesus. There's some dialogue. And I didn't really think about all of the undertones of prophecy that were there until Caleb cross-referenced and brought those up, which I appreciated. I also knew that I had no reason to be nervous when he started with a historical reference and then closed with that too. So I just appreciated how we were able to go back into the Old Testament to find and to kind of open our eyes so that we weren't experiencing the same sort of confusion that I think that the disciples were. So in the end, suffering is something that was foreshadowed by Christ, and it's something that is also expected of us because we are to live like Christ. And if we're going to have a relationship with him that grows, we need to understand Christ came and lived to suffer for his first coming. And we are then called, if we're going to live for him, we're going to live and we're going to suffer too. So I think that was good foreshadowing. And while the theme is obviously a little bit depressing, it was good that we were able to get all of that details out of this small passage. It's a good little nugget.
Yeah, I agree. I think it came across as encouraging, even though it was kind of like a depressing type message. Like, yep, you're going to suffer, but you're going to be happy about it. So, I thought it was great. But Caleb, was there anything cutting room floor wise that you felt like you didn't get to touch on?
I mean, honestly, this week, I feel like not so much was on the cutting room floor. Obviously, you do have to decide where you're going to go and what you're going to expand on because it is only 5 verses. This coming weekend, we'll be reading much more of a story. There will be a lot of verses to cover, and a lot of crazy things happen once they get down that mountain. So I could see next week having more stuff to cut, but to really appreciate the gravity of the situation because most people know about the transfiguration, but it's kind of this weird moment in the gospel Mark. It's kind of like, oh, neat that happened. What's the overall point of it? And so before the idea of suffering is going to be wrestled with, I thought Micah did a great job bringing us through the transfiguration. There's so much significance tied to that moment. And I really wanted to borrow from that significance, as Jesus did down the mountain, because it is the same significance leading to their command. We do have a command from the God the Father and then a command from God the Son coming down the mountain. And so because the first command was listen to him, and then in Mark's narrative eyes, the next opportunity is Jesus speaking, and it's an opportunity to listen to him. Do not mention this until I rise from the dead, not even until I die, but until I resurrect. So it was fun to play with that and try to just bring out why they were confused, but then ultimately the clarity of it. And so that's where the notes sort of took shape. It was not a hard passage to interpret, like to Cole's point, very narrative. It's a passage of transition. Most of the language is just in the middle, in between this and this. Here they are. But there is that command, immediate confusion about it based on their tradition, their Jewish tradition.
I mean, when in doubt, the disciples are going to be confused. That's
right.
Something that we're seeing a lot, at least in Mark's account. And I mean, Mark was one of the gospel writers who was not one of the 12 disciples. So I feel like he really does them dirty a lot when you talk about them. I don't know if Matthew and John are going to be writing the same way that Mark did.
Sure.
Because he wasn't necessarily there. He's writing maybe for someone else who was. I really appreciated that throughout everything that we saw in this passage, the same theme, the same takeaway was, and I wrote this down. It might have been something that you said, Caleb, but it was, or something close to what you said. The glory of Christ is correctly understood through the path of his suffering, or through the lens of his suffering, understanding that the suffering had to happen first. You were speaking to tradition, and something that it was a really big misconception for the Jewish people was that the Messiah was only coming as this mighty Messiah and not as a suffering servant. They didn't have that mindset. Now, we could talk about why they didn't have that mindset. Why weren't they interpreting the scriptures certain ways? There were definitely prophecies about Christ coming in a humble way. We think of the passage in Isaiah when it's talking about Christ's birth and lowly, humble means. But they were also experiencing suffering themselves under the oppression of Rome. And all they really wanted in that moment, in that human suffering moment, was someone to save them. And they were forgetting about what they really needed saving from, which was their sin. I think that we can better understand the glory of who God is and how much he loves us when we understand that he had to suffer for us, not just that he's going to save us from the bad things that happened to us.
Right.
I understand his love much more when I understand that personal aspect of it.
Yep.
I mean,
and even though the passage is mundane and they're in transition, if it's Jesus with a few people and he's speaking so clearly, there were things to pull out of that. And so I tried very intentionally to put application throughout the sermon as well, not just kind of at the end. A lot of teaching models is just by default at the end you throw up some questions or application. I did provide some additional questions in the sermon notes, questions for further study, but it really did bring out that idea that our witness should be cruciform, because he's actually asking their witness to be. If you're going to talk,
get into the etymology of the word cruciform, because I hadn't heard it until Sunday.
Sure.
I know that crucifixion comes from a cruci comes from like crucifixion. Form is the Latin for to shape. So I was just wondering where we got that word and why you chose to use that word and highlight it.
Well, it literally means cross shaped, a crucifix, a
Cruciform. Right.
So it's the shape of a cross. So I was using it symbolically to say our witness should be cross shaped. We should be representing and embodying the cross of Christ. He's bringing up that idea now, but in the form of do not talk about what you just saw on the mountain until I come back from the dead. The other side of death is when you're gonna understand glory and you're gonna proclaim it.
Right.
And so the insinuation of that application statement, our witness should be cruciform, is the opposite of maybe the prosperity gospel,
right.
or that our witness should be this heightened, everything's great and wonderful and beautiful and blah, 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 you need to get your act together, this sort of thing. But no, if we are dead, we die to sin, we participate in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So therein, our witness should be shaped like that.
And in the same way, we don't want our witness to be about us. Like we think of how the Pharisees were rebuked. And just in the way that they prayed or the way that they interacted with people, it was all about them. Their witness was about how perfect they were.
Sure.
And unfortunately, some people who would claim to be believers their witness is how good they are and how they have benefited from doing what Christ said to do.
So that would be an example of a witness where the line between I have been good and I am godly are blurred, but this is just the opposite of that. And so he's already alluding, and that's why suffering, we talked about suffering because that appears in the passage. And it's also fascinating. I didn't have time to unpack this a ton, but in Jesus' answer, the clarity section of the sermon outline, he says, how is it written that Elijah must suffer? And then it says, it is written of him. So Jesus is, even in this mundane down the mountain moment, he demonstrates biblical dependency twice. And it's Jesus doing that. And so it's this idea of if you want clarity, ask yourself, well, where might it be written? And then you see, oh, it is written. And so it all fits that plan. But along those lines, I also try to bring out this idea that it's actually okay that we wrestle with the timing of God's plan. This passage is an example of them doing that, wrestling with the timing of God's plan. What just happened? And they are familiar with down the mountain. That's where they came from. Now, to go back to something like that, to have a transfiguration moment in the middle of Jesus' active ministry would be such a jolt to them. They would not want to go back down. And so we wrestle with the timing of God's plan, and that's okay. A lot of people might assume the goal is to not wrestle. I think the goal is to wrestle well. Who are you going to talk to? They seized upon the statement of Christ.
Right.
What must he have meant by that.
And I think in our lives, we even have transfiguration moments
Mhm.
where we feel that in a very clear way, God is revealing himself and his character to us.
Mhm.
We aren't going to maybe have a literal transfiguration moment.
Right.
I don't know anyone who has had that experience. But like you said, we have that moment that we might call it in our American culture a spiritual high. And after we experience that, we kind of feel this withdrawal from it when we go back down the mountain, when we go
Right.
back to the real world, and we find ourselves back in the mundane.
Mhm.
But Christ is in that mundane time, just like he was with us in that transfiguration moment. And I think that's important for some people to realize that the way that Christ gave instructions to his disciples as he went down the mountain to be focused on the cross, be focused on the suffering and the love that Christ had for is going to have and has for them, is where we should that's where our mindset should be, not in the idea of missing that spiritual moment
Yeah.
on the mountain, I guess.
And I liked your statement too about like it's not God's timing isn't for us to understand, it's for us to trust. I felt like that was a good clarification for me anyway, because I think we wrestle with it, and when we wrestle with it, we think we're trying to be like, oh, I don't get it. And that's why we're wrestling. But we're even in our wrestling, we're not meant to get it, and we're
Right.
not going to. It's just about trusting it.
Yep.
Which is hard.
Yep, very hard. And to Cole's point earlier about the disciples always being confused, even though the gospel narratives give us their confusion so often, the one thing that's constant is their fellowship with Christ. And so that is what carries them through. Their intellectual assent to what Jesus is doing is not what carries them through and makes them influential in biblical literature. It's Jesus offered himself to them, and they maintained that fellowship with him throughout it all, and then become obviously influential in the early church. But he's equipping them, and we're going to see in this passage next week that Jesus is about to accomplish so many different things in a very chaotic scene, and one of those things is to teach his disciples. So he's already doing that before they get there. Jesus is teaching us before, in the middle, and after anything we might encounter. And so it's just a reminder that this world is going to include that. Like that's actually the easy part about preaching or teaching about suffering. Like you guys both alluded to, it's kind of uncomfy and unfun, but it is inevitable. Everyone is going to suffer.
True.
And so you're at least hitting home something that is going to happen in this life. And I tried to bring that out. We're all going to suffer. The question is to what degree and to what end, and what is our perspective going to be? It's why Jesus said what he said, in this world, you will find trouble, but there's only one way to take heart. I have overcome the world. Christ, focus.
There definitely was also not just an element of suffering as a theme in this passage, but also the importance of God's timing, which we alluded to in our conversation at the very beginning. I appreciated the historical allegory that you made with Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. When I thought about it, I was wondering a little bit with how his timing with releasing that and God's timing with the cross were related.
Right.
But it really made sense when we brought in the Battle of Antietam and how Abraham Lincoln waited until that victory moment to share this important proclamation.
Yep.
Because I think you're right. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation would have changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, if it was not done at the right time, would it have given that morale boost?
Right.
Would it have given that? Would it have given the boost that the Union needed to kind of finish the war?
Sure. I mean, you guys mentioned earlier what cutting room floor, that almost didn't make it, that whole thing, because I'm researching it. So I asked myself, okay, what in history has been so influential, so monumental, ideally relating to freedom or life change, where there was an original group that knew about it, and then there was a strategic, revealing of that plan. The Emancipation Proclamation thing is interesting because there's always a point where an illustration would fall flat. So, for example, I didn't get into this, but every slave was not freed on January 1st, 1863, obviously, right? Like there's an amendment that the war had to officially end. And so that's why I left it instead at that 6-month timeline of him presenting it to his cabinet officials and them waiting for a victory to then give them the ammunition they need, metaphorically, to deliver it with authority. So if that was declared before that battle or before the trajectory of the war was heading in the North's favor, it wouldn't necessarily mean anything
He didn't have the authority.
Didn't have the authority, certainly didn't have the ear and the influence. And so to realize that and to find that historian's quote, people do look at Antietam, because I'm like, what? Like a battle in the late fall of 1863 is how is it the most influential war if it happened 2 years and change before the actual end of the war? Now you get into a bunch of strategic reasons for that, but that is the shifting tide. There are a lot of reasons that victory for the North that are fascinating reasons that have nothing to do with Mark, so I didn't mention them. But to answer your question, like you appreciating that working well, it's because of that 6-month timeline. I was like, how crazy is it that we know this is 6 months before he dies on the cross, and he goes on the mountain and he says, "Here it is. Here's the deal. Here's who I am." Pure, unadulterated Jesus on the mountain, and then on the way down, zip it, insinuating we're going to need to wait for victory. Like, I'm here for victory over sin.
Right.
I'm here to offer freedom. And so that was very easy to tie in with the cross and the bloodiest day. And what a legacy the bloodiest day in American history has, because the slaves were able to be freed. Well, you read something like that, you're like, okay, there it is.
So I want to let you know, Caleb, there's some speculation that the only reason you chose to use this specific analogy is because if you, Caleb Pearson, were to lose the mustache and were to put on a top hat, you would look a lot like Abraham Lincoln, especially in your outfit.
This is you and your little crony speculation.
All I'm gonna
your
say,
friend group.
I'm not gonna get into who's speculating with me. It's not fair. I'm not gonna name drop here for the first time on the podcast.
Yeah.
But all I'm gonna say is it's refreshing to hear that there was a lot more that went into your selection, other than the fact that you could pass for Abe Lincoln on Halloween this Friday.
Cole, I love you. Yeah, and again, like shout out to the worship team too, because I get to coordinate with them a little bit leading up to the weeks, and we know what we're singing, and to tie that in, this idea of the Son of Suffering, and we're praising him for that. I mean, that is so otherworldly that we are thanking God for suffering, that he paid it all, and understanding that was why he came. It's not a detour in the plan. It was the plan. And that I mentioned, let me just mention it real quick again. The 1 Corinthians passage, we preach Christ crucified. How easy would it be to just preach Christ glorified? Way more fun, way less controversial, very shiny, attention grabbing, but that's not the gospel. Jesus on the mountain didn't save anyone. And it's been fun to coordinate with the preaching team and talk with Micah, because I asked Micah, I said, hey, how hard are you hitting like the cross of Christ and like the gospel? And he's like, I'm mentioning the gospel, but I'm not going to like hit it. Oh, I'm not going to hit people over the head with it. I was like, okay, good. I'll hit them over the head with it because of this call to suffering on the way down the mountain. And both of those moments, as we'll see when we get into the third stage of Mark 9, it's equipping them and preparing them for that. They were given a sound theology of glory and a sound theology of suffering before interacting with everyone at the bottom of the mountain. And we're going to see the fruit of that this coming week.
And then in the same way, how then can we interact with one another when we experience suffering within our body? If we have all experienced that mountaintop moment and then have experienced being at the bottom of the mountain, back in like the real world, the mundane life that we have, how can we then interact with each other? How can we encourage one another throughout sufferings without sounding like unhelpful? I mean, how would that's my question that I would ask. Yeah. How can we interact with people who are in the midst of suffering without just throwing 1 Corinthians 1:22-23 at them or Romans 8:18, for I consider the sufferings at this present time not worthy to be compared with the future glory that is to be revealed to us? That's a very powerful verse. Right. But if you're in the midst of suffering, sometimes it's a slap in the face when someone says, oh, it's going to be better. Right. The glory is going to be great. It's not worth to be compared. Yep. So then how do we approach that moment? Right.
And so that's a good question, because right there you're saying, oh, it's going to get better. Oh, it'll be okay. Oh, just a little more God. That is not witness that is cruciform. Right. That is accidental witness that is vaguely prosperous or vaguely just kind of cling to God. That's okay. It can certainly lead to fruit because you're pointing to the true act of God.
We need to look at suffering in the right lens. If we're looking at suffering as just something that we're experiencing and not a part of the Christian walk that is literally literally showing the world
What
how
is
Christ lived.
what does the enemy want us to think? He wants us to think our suffering and our sin makes us incompatible with God, right? But our suffering and sin makes us compatible with God because of Jesus,
Right.
because Jesus became sin and suffering. 2 Corinthians 5:21, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God. It's because of Christ taking on of suffering and sin that we become righteousness. And that's an identity truth. So that starts with the gospel and being in Christ. So to your point of somebody wrestling with suffering and sin, there is one critical question. Is that person a believer or not? Because if they aren't, they need the gospel, and the gospel hard, that what you are dealing with has been dealt with on the cross. He died for the sins, not for ours only, but for the sins of the whole world. And then if you're talking with a believer, there is an identity reminder in that, and then a perspective, those three questions. Do we trust God's timing? A lot of times people look forward to try to trust God's timing based on our own confidence. We need to look backwards at how God has provided to trust God's timing. Do we understand suffering? And I mean a biblical theology of suffering and what it's for and where to take heart, because he has overcome the world already. We haven't. He has. And then lastly, do we know his love for us? Christians, I deal with 150 of them under the age of 18 every week.
God be with you.
They are, I ask the question, do we know his love for us? And then I tie that into the gospel, for God so loved the world. But there are a lot of believers that do not know the degree to which they are loved by God. Like God died on the cross 2,000 years ago as kind of a favor, a slight to them. Sure, I'll let you in, but I'm a distant God who's now leaving you up to your own devices. That isn't by no means the case. So we're called to that walk of sanctification with him. It's by grace through faith in Christ, and that is a lifelong clinging. It's dependency, really. And we're going to see this audience in Mark need that dependency. I think there's 4 different people groups, 4 different things happening in this next passage, and it's all going to boil down to dependency on Christ for all of them.
One thing that I find really surprising, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised at this point after seeing how the disciples have reacted to everything that Jesus has done, the first 8.5 chapters of Mark.
Mm-hmm.
But not to get too far ahead of where this thing is going, but he's going to be on his way to Calvary, and they are going to still be astonished at what's going on. They are going to still be expecting him to, in the end, overcome the Romans and not die the way that he did.
Political conqueror in shiny armor.
Right. And how often are we like that? In the same way that you were just discussing with when we experience our sufferings, when something isn't going our way. How often are we wanting Jesus to just fix our problems and be the one who's going to perform a miracle, give us the instant gratification that we need to make us feel better, when in all reality, Christ is not going to, like, as you said, kind of towards the end, he is the mighty Messiah, but through that suffering servanthood. He is there to walk with us. He is not there to snap his fingers like a genie in a magic lamp to make us feel good when we're feeling sad.
Right.
That is an outcome of having a relationship with him. And when we depend on him and trust him, we will experience that peace. Maybe that peace will show itself with some happiness and joy sometimes, but
we crave our roses and our accolades on this side of heaven. Why? And then we measure God to that degree. It's like the story I shared with Jim and I in the car, and just being reminded, God, what is God's desire? It's not my wishes. It's not that he doesn't care about me, but that's not his desire. His desire is my satisfaction in him, and learning that content in Christ posture. It helps 1 Peter 5:10. It puts some meat to those bones of, after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. We try to do those 4 things on our own all the time. That would be hijacking God's plan. And then we take from God's plan and then get mad at him. Be like, what are you doing, God? And he's like, what are you doing? It's like if my 2-year-old put his hand on the wheel while I'm driving and then said, Dad, why are you driving like that? That's not yielding or trusting. So that's the beauty of all these stories being in scripture like this, and the way we here at FBC are unpacking it 1 week at a time. I'm growing in my appreciation for this gospel, especially because there's so much there.
Yeah, it's very deep, and I'm grateful, Cole, that you were here to help us dig in. Did you have anything else?
I did have.
Too short.
It's okay. I have one last question, and it's kind of a little nitty gritty detail, so I wanted to throw it in quickly at the end.
Sure.
At the end of the passage, we find out that John the Baptist was the Elijah figure proclaiming the way of the Lord. And I was wondering, when you were doing your research, Caleb, did you find any people who were commenting on this passage that did not maybe understand Elijah to be the Elijah in Jesus's comments in Mark 9, 12, and 13 to be that John the Baptist character, but did they take it literally to be Elijah? Or is there any other interpretations of that? Because looking at it without a commentary in front of you,
Sure.
not everyone is going to read that.
No,
and
of course
think
not.
that it's talking about John the Baptist. So I was wondering what your
and
thoughts.
according to Mark's perspective, there's kind of no way to know he's talking about John the Baptist unless you really cling to Jesus' words. If he has come and he suffered many things, because then you could go backwards in Mark, be like, okay, who suffered many things?
Well, John the Baptist did,
and John the
die,
Baptist did. So that could be how you get it from Mark's gospel,
right?
But that's why, to answer your question, yes, there are other views out there. They don't carry a ton of weight because Matthew 17:13 verbatim, then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Perfect. So you dig one level deep, you do find a Bible verse that is the sound context, the same interaction.
Yes. And you mentioned that when you started your third point.
Right. So we know it's him, but it gets dicey, and this was the tension of the sermon as well as far as cutting room floor stuff. Once you bring in prophecy, it's kind of like, all right, that's not the main point that Jesus is rallying his people behind, because they're moving down the mountain based on what they've just seen. But there is prophecy involved. That Malachi prophecy, so is John Elijah? Were they the same guy? Did Elijah come from heaven and change his name? To what degree was John, so he was an Elijah-like figure. That precedent has been set throughout Scripture and throughout prophecy, that there are prefigurements, that there are elements of a prophecy. And so the Malachi passage, there's weight to there being an element of that prophecy in the future as well, because it talks about all sorts of fathers and children and the uniting and dividing and all sorts of it's prophecy, so it can get crazy. But to keep the main thing would be look at the synoptic gospel, affirm that it's John the Baptist, and Matthew's account is the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. So that's a fascinating difference. Jesus never said it was John the Baptist.
Right. And since Matthew was there, you can only assume that these three went and talked to Matthew about it afterwards, and they were chatting it up.
Yep. and since God's word's inspired and inerrant, it's accurate. The disciples then understood. They understood the truth that he was speaking to them.
They understood something
of John the Baptist.
No offense to the disciples.
Yeah. But he's the forerunner. It ties into his idea of suffering. The point is, the plan is here, but here's where it's leading. The closer they get, it's Lord of the Rings-esque. The closer they get to the end, the crazier and unfortunately darker it's going to get. So we'll see how that plays out.
Nice. Thank you.
Cole, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'd love to come back, even after my little jabs. I hope you can let me come back.
Yeah,
you can let me come back.
I guess that's up to Caleb. For all of our listeners and viewers, remember that we love to hear from you. You can send over your thoughts, questions, or requests, and head over to fbcva.org/podcasts and write us your notes and comments. Also, be sure to check out our other two Fellowship Bible Church podcasts out there. There's the Fellowship Family and the Global Church Podcast. The fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love and God bless.